Hey everybody, in this video we're going to talk about Sony's A9, A9II camera body, and we're going to jump into the menu system and get you set up for wildlife photography and birds in flight. There's a lot to cover. There are 6 main chapters in the menu system, and so I'm going to do them one chapter at a time. So this will be chapter number 1, and there are 14 pages of items that we're going to cover. So come with me now. Let's get into this menu system and get your camera set up for wildlife photography. Now we're going to get into the menu system. Of course, you access that by hitting your main menu button. And once you're within the menu system now, you have what I call chapters. There are 6 chapters. And when you're within a chapter, you have various pages that you can go to. And you can see what page you're on down here and also here with the number. And you navigate throughout the menu system by using your control wheel here. And you press to the right to go to the various other pages within a chapter, or if you want to select something, you press the center button here. The way that you can quickly move between chapters is by using your front dial that's up here, and you can see that I'm going to spin that front dial and I move quickly between the chapters. The very first item is file format. We're in chapter 1, page 1, and we have various choices here. I've highlighted the file format here, and then when you want to make changes, you hit the center of your control wheel, and you have your choices here: RAW and JPEG. And I don't really want to get into it here about what you should shoot, but I'll just say that you should shoot what works for you. And for me, JPEGs work, and so I select JPEGs. You make your own choice on there what you want to do. And once you make your choice there, then you have other things you can choose. For example, if you're shooting RAW, you can shoot compressed or uncompressed. If you're shooting JPEGs, you can choose the quality and the image size of your JPEGs. Then you can change your aspect ratio. Of course, 3:2 is a standard 35mm aspect ratio, but you have other choices here: 16:9, square, and 4:3. And you can always go back to the previous item by pressing the menu button, and that gives you an idea. Tells you about that here. The last item here is your choice of APS-C Super 35. That means that if you have a lens that is made for a crop sensor camera and you put it on, it will shoot in that crop sensor mode if you're in either the auto choice or the on choice. And the Super 35 is for movies. Again, it'll shoot a crop mode if you're in auto or on. If it's in off, you'll always shoot in full frame mode. I just leave that on auto. Moving over to page 2 of chapter 1, we do that by navigating with our main control wheel, and we press to the right and we jump to page 2. You can see there our choices here are long exposure noise reduction. I leave that in the off position because I don't do any long exposures with wildlife, but you can see that you can't choose this when you're using the electronic shutter. That's why it's grayed out, and that's okay. We don't need it anyway for wildlife photography. Next choice is high ISO noise reduction. The default is the normal, but I prefer to do most of my noise reduction in post-processing, so I put mine on low. Next choice is color space. You have 2 choices there. Adobe RGB, which has a wider gamut of colors. They say in theory that there are millions of more colors with Adobe RGB color space than with sRGB. But if you do a lot of home printing, or if you sell a lot of your pictures on Shutterstock and other microstocks like I do, then sRGB is a little bit quicker and it's a better color space for those of you who are in that category. Lens compensation is next. I leave that to the defaults, which is shading compensation is auto, chromatic aberration is auto, and distortion compensation I just leave off. Next, we're going to navigate to page number 3. Okay, self-timer. When you're going to use a self-timer, of course you don't do that much for wildlife photography, but when you do, that's where you change your self-timer, and you can go in there and you can make changes to it. When you go in here, you can see that there's little arrows here to the left and to the right, so you could change your self-timer from 2 seconds to 5 seconds to 10 seconds if you were going to make a change there with self-timer. Menu always brings you back to the previous place where you were, so I hit the menu there to come back into page 3. Bracket settings, that's how you want to make changes to your brackets. Bracket type, self-timer during bracket, and bracket order, 0, minus, and plus. You make changes to the bracket settings there, but I don't bracket with wildlife, so I don't touch anything there. Interval shoot function, again, that's more of a scenic area where you're going to do a change there if you're doing some sort of scenic photography. It's not really useful for wildlife photography, so I leave that alone. The next two items on our list work in concert with each other. They're the recall button and the memory button. First, you would go into the memory button and you would see that you have your custom menu number 1, 2, and 3. Those are on the camera. And you access those through your main control mode up here on the top of the camera. And then you can also register often used shooting modes 1, 2, 3, and 4 to a memory card. I don't register any of mine to a memory card. I find that the 3 on the camera are enough. So I just have those that I can recall. And then you can see that recall here is grayed out because that's only for recalling ones that are written to a memory card. All right, next, moving on, we have select media. Obviously, you have 2 slots in the camera, and I have mine set up to do slot number 1 is still pictures, and slot number 2 is to do video, and I'll show you when we get to that how to make those choices. But for now, my main slot that I'm using is slot number 1. Moving on to page 4 of chapter 1, here's our register custom shoot set. This is where you go in to register those custom functions that you use all the time to your main mode dial, 1, 2, or 3. And you select it, and then you get to choose. Recall custom hold 1, 2, or 3. You select it again, and now you have a choice what you want to be able to change with a check mark. You put it, if you want to change the shoot mode to shutter priority, you select that. If you want to change that to something different, you can see that I selected it, and I can choose manual, aperture, or whatever. Then I go backwards with the menu button, and then as I go down, I can say that since I'm in shutter priority mode, I want my shutter speed to be a 2,000th of a second. So I can select 2,000th of a second, and there it shows up there. I want my drive mode to be continuous shooting. I want my exposure compensation. In this case, I was thinking that I'd be photographing a lot of white birds, so I did a minus 0.7, 2/3 of a stop on my exposure compensation. My ISO, I'm going to do auto ISO. My metering mode is multi. Continuous focus. Focus area is tracking. Autofocus sensitivity is locked on. Autofocus on is on. That means when I press the autofocus button, I autofocus. And then it comes down and says, do you want to register those? Yes, I do. So I hit the center button. And there I've registered those to custom hold number 1. Then I'm going in the menu, move over to page number 5. The first item here is priority setting in AFS, and the default is balance emphasis. I don't shoot in AFS, so I just leave it there. I did make a change here for the priority setting in AFC. That's where I leave my camera continuous focus, and you have a choice here where the camera wants to do the priority on the autofocus, on the release of the shutter, or a balanced emphasis. I find that AF, leaving it there, is very accurate and very quick, and it makes sure that the camera is going to be focused before you actually take the picture, and I think that's important, so that's why I put mine on AF. Focus area is next, and I think there's more talk about which focus area to choose with Sony cameras than any other menu item. I choose wide for birds in flight. You can see as you select it, there are tons of choices here. A lot of people like zone, and then you have a whole host of tracking modes. You can see when I choose the tracking, there's arrows to the left and the right, and I can choose different tracking modes as well. But I find that the camera is great just in the wide zone. That's for birds in flight. Now, it does tend to focus on whatever's front and center, so this works great against a non-distracting background. For a flying bird against the sky or against the water or something like that, wide works excellent. Focus settings is next. That allows you to configure the camera to set up and change your focus settings using either your control wheel, your rear dial, or your front dial. I leave mine set up to set so I can change it with the rear dial, so I can enter that, and then with my main control wheel I can change my focus settings very quickly. Next item is focus area limit. That allows you to get rid of some of the focus areas that you don't use. You select that, and you can see that there's check marks on most of these. But if you don't ever use zone focus, then you can uncheck it, And if you don't ever use the center focus, you can uncheck that one. And those on the top are your normal focus modes, and on the bottom are your tracking modes. You can uncheck those as well. I don't normally use tracking zone, so I'm going to turn those off. You see I unchecked those. And the ones that I want to be able to toggle through have check marks on them. And once you make the choices how you want it to be, then of course you go down to the OK and you select that. And that allows you to limit so that when you're in and changing the focus area, it doesn't take so long to get to the ones that you want. Next up is to switch the vertical horizontal autofocus area. That means if you got a certain focus area chosen and you've moved that focus area to a certain part of the frame, and then you switch from a horizontal to a vertical shot, it will automatically switch that. I've left that off because I just don't use that all that often, and so I just leave it to the default position, which is off. Moving on to page number 6 of chapter 1, we have autofocus illuminator. That's a light that comes on and helps you focus in dark situations. But by default, that is turned off, and it doesn't work with continuous autofocus anyways, which is where I leave my camera, so that we don't need to touch. Face eye settings, that I do have turned on with the subject detection of animal. Of course, you can switch that to humans. And then left, right doesn't make a difference with animals. And face eye frame display, I want that to show me the little square on the animal's eye when it's working. And animal eye display is also on. Autofocus tracking sensitivity. This gets a lot of discussion as well with wildlife photographers. You select it and you have choices of 1 through 5. One means that it's going to lock on the subject and it's not going to let go of that subject. Once you autofocus on a moving bird, let's say it's moving around the lake, it's going to stay locked onto that bird even if another bird flies in front of it or moves in front of it, or if the bird moves in front of some leaves or some sticks or something like that. That will be locked onto that bird. And the other ones, of course, are a variety of different choices until you get to number 5, which means responsive, which means that the autofocus will switch between anything that travels in front of whatever you're photographing. So if you've got 2 birds moving in the frame, whichever one is closest is where the camera's gonna focus on. And I like to keep that on locked on so that I can choose which bird to photograph and which bird I want to have in focus. Aperture drive in autofocus is next. Leave that on focus priority. You can prioritize the shutter to be more quiet if you choose silent priority, but I don't care about that, so I leave that in focus priority. Autofocus with the shutter. This is where you set up your back button focus. All right, if you just want your shutter button to take the picture, then you come into this one here and you turn this to off, which is where I have mine. So now I'm using my back button focus to both focus, hold the focus, and then my shutter button only takes the picture. This is where you set that up. Chapter 1, page 6, you turn on your back button focus by turning this autofocus with shutter to the off position. Pre-autofocus, I leave that to the off position. According to the manual, it says that that will set whether or not to perform autofocus before the shutter button is half pressed. I just leave that to the off position. And we'll move on to page number 7. Eye start autofocus is grayed out because we're shooting animal eye priority, so you can't choose that. Autofocus area registration. That means you can move a certain autofocus area that you want to a certain point in the frame, and then you can recall it with a custom function button, but I don't use that at all, so I just leave that to the off. Then you can delete that registered area by choosing this menu item, and then you would go up to OK and then delete that registered focus area. But again, since I'm not registering any focus areas, I leave that and don't touch that one. Focus frame color, I choose white because I find that the contrast between white and most of what I'm photographing is very useful to be able to see it best. But you can also choose red if you want by selecting it and going to the red and choosing red. Autofocus area auto clear, that's only for single focus, so for continuous focus it doesn't come into play. But what that means is the autofocus area will disappear shortly after it comes on when you're in single focus. But again, I use continuous focus all the time, so that doesn't come into play for me. Display continuous autofocus area, that one I do use because I shoot in continuous autofocus and I want to see where that autofocus area is as I'm shooting, so that's I leave to the on position. Moving on to page number 8. Sorry for the change in light there. The sun went down and now the sun has come back up and I'm doing the rest of this video, starting with page number 8. So the first item here is phase detect area. What that means is if you have a lens that uses combined autofocus and phase detection, then those autofocus points will show up here. But my lens doesn't do that, so I just leave it to the off position. Circulation of autofocus points. That means if you've got an autofocus point and you're moving it across the frame, for some reason, maybe there's a bird on the edge of your frame, and you get to the edge, then the autofocus point will jump around and circle and come back to the other side. That's not useful for me, so I leave that on does not circulate, which is the default anyway. Autofocus micro adjustment, that means if you have a lens that's focusing to the rear or to the front a little bit, then you would go into this and you would compensate for that. But my lens focuses just fine, just the way I got it, so I don't touch that either. And we'll move on to page number 9. Exposure compensation. Well, this is one way you can come into this menu and do it, but I actually do my exposure compensation up here with the main compensation dial. While I'm out in the field, I find that's quicker and easier, so I just leave this at the 0 point to start. Reset EV compensation. What that means is if you've reset your exposure compensation here in this menu, then when you turn off the camera, it's going to remember what you got it to, or it's going to reset itself. So for example, if you had made the exposure compensation here, let's say you made it a minus 0.7, and then you have this set to reset, what that means is if you turn off the camera, it's just going to reset this back to the 0 point once you power it back up. And I have that on reset, even though I don't use this as a way to set my compensation. I just have that at reset, which is the default. ISO setting is our next item, and there's a lot you can do here. You can change your ISO here, but I have mine set to the default, which is pressing to the right on the main control wheel. That's easier when you're out in the field than going into a menu. But here's where you want to set up your ISO parameters by going in here and setting up your range limit. Now when I'm using auto ISO, I don't want the limit to go beyond 8,000. I think the noise of this camera is manageable at that level. So I go in here and I set my minimum ISO to be 50 and my maximum to be 8,000. Of course, that's when I'm using the ISO auto feature. Okay, you got to decide for yourself what you think your noise level is. If you want to go higher on the ISO, you certainly can, but I find about 8,000 is as high as I want to go. And then ISO auto minimum shutter speed. That's a useful item as well. So if you're using an auto ISO, you got to tell the camera what minimum shutter speed you want, so it doesn't just automatically always pick a high ISO. If you've got a lot of light and you set this to 1,000th of a second, then the camera will put down and make it a lower ISO, and that of course reduces the amount of noise you have. So set that to whatever shutter speed you want when you're using auto ISO. Moving down, metering mode. Of course, there's center weighted and spot metering and all of those. But for this camera and today's algorithms that are built into here for metering the scenes, I find that the multi works just fine. So I leave my camera on multi all the time. Face priority and multi-metering, I have that off because my camera is set to autofocus on animal faces, so this doesn't come into play. The spot metering point, if I was going to do spot metering, I want it to be right in the center, but as I said, I usually use multi-metering anyway, so that doesn't change, I just leave it at the center. Move on to page number 10. Exposure step, you can choose half stops or third of stops. Third of stops give you a little more precision, so I choose third of stops there. AEL with shutter, what that means is it sets and locks the exposure when you press the shutter halfway down. I just leave that on auto. I don't want to adjust my focus and exposure separately, so I leave that on auto. And then this next one, exposure standard adjustment, it's going to want to correct the exposure value. And if you press it and go in there, it says this function adjusts the standard of optimum exposure. Generally, it's not necessary, so I don't do anything there. Cancel out of this and move on to page 11. This is your flash menu here, and I'm not going to cover that in this video. I'll do a separate video for flash. I only use flash when I'm photographing hummingbirds, so we'll talk about that at another time. And then moving on to page 12, we have a white balance as the first item. You can change it through this menu, but I find it quicker to set it up to my custom button number 1 on the top of the camera, so that's where I have mine. Then you have a priority setting in auto white balance. You can tell and prioritize a certain tone if you're using auto white balance for the camera to think about. I don't do anything with that, so I just leave that at standard. Auto HDR, DRO, I leave that at off. That's for doing HDR images. Of course, I'm not using that for wildlife photography. Creative style is a choice here. For those of you who don't shoot RAW, you would want to make a change here. There's all kinds of choices of what you can choose. Vivid, standard, neutral, clear for skin tones. I like the vivid look for my JPEGs, so I set that to vivid. But again, if you're shooting RAW files, you wouldn't make a change to that. It doesn't matter. Picture effect, that's things like toy camera effect, pop the colors, posterization and stuff like that. But that stuff is, I find that more like a gimmick than anything else, so I just leave that at the off position. Shutter auto white balance lock is next. I leave that in the off position. That's just the normal auto white balance. If you select that, you can choose shutter halfway down and continuous shooting to make changes to that. What that means is that it'll lock the white balance when the shutter is pressed halfway down or during continuous shooting. But I don't actually use auto white balance all that much anyway, so I just leave that off. Moving on to page 13. Here we have our focus assist menus. This is for when you're doing some manual focus. And the first one, the focus magnifier, is grayed out. That's because my camera right now and my lens is set to continuous focus, so you cannot use a focus magnifier when you're in continuous focus. But then, when I do go into a manual focus situation, the manual focus time, I don't want it to be limited. So I put that at no limit, but you can have it time out at a certain time if you want, a few seconds. But I like to leave it on that as long as I want to manually focus, so I have it at no limit. Next one, the initial focus magnification. This is again for manually focusing. It gives you a little bit of an assistance so you can see the scene better. I have that at 4.7. Your only choices there are 1.0 and 4.7. So I like to see an enlarged subject, and that helps me focus better on it when I am manually focusing. Autofocus in focus magnification. That means if you do have a focus magnifier turned on, and again, it doesn't work when you're in continuous focus, but if you do have it turned on, it'll focus on a smaller area within the focus frame. But again, I have that off now because I normally shoot wildlife in continuous autofocus, and so none of that comes into play. Manual focus assist, I do want that to come on when I'm manually focusing, so it'll magnify whatever I'm looking at 4.7 times, and I do want that on with the manual focus. Peaking setting, what that means is that it will show you an outline of the in-focus areas when you're focusing manually. But for autofocus, which I use 99% of the time for wildlife, that doesn't come into play. Moving on to the last page, page 14 of this chapter. This is a bunch of things that don't come into play for wildlife photography. Anti-flicker shooting, that's if you're shooting under fluorescent lights and they're flickering, the camera will detect that. But that doesn't come into play when you're shooting with continuous focus, so that's grayed out. Same thing here for high frequency flicker. It's the same sort of thing, but we don't need it for wildlife photography. Face registration, again, you can prioritize whether or not the camera focuses on a certain face that you've registered, but we're not doing that with wildlife photography, so we don't do any changes there. And the last item is grayed out as well. Okay, so if you made it this far, we've covered now one chapter out of the 6 in the menus of the Sony A9 body, and we're going to get into those other chapters in later videos, but I appreciate you watching and sticking with me this far. If you do have questions, you can hit me up in the comment section, or you can click the link to my website, get my email address, and send me an email, and I'll get your questions answered that way as well. Thanks a lot for watching.